Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is a very big episode. We had a major decision from the state Supreme Court, a major creative and destructive decision from the state Supreme Court. We'll talk about that and the implications for broader income taxes coming up with Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director. We'll also be speaking with Finne, our Center for Education Director, about her work and what she's seeing in the education field, and specifically the movement to try to reduce the number of instructional hours that students receive, even after the major learning losses that occurred during COVID. So we'll be looking at that. I want to remind everybody that if you have a question at any point during any presentation, just add it to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's the little box with the two chat bubbles there. Try to do that rather than the chat because it's easier for the moderator, me, to see those questions and track them and make sure that we get your questions answered during this broadcast. I also want to point people to our blog at washingtonpolicy.org. Last time around, we talked with Mark Harmsworth, our Center for Small Business Director, about what was happening in Spokane. They had one fee for a certain type of multifamily housing going up by 2,000 some odd percent. I mean, it was just insane increase. Well, the public outrage was heard, and they've backed off on that fee increase for now. You can read about it in Mark's blog at washingtonpolicy.org. There's also a great new blog by Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, about the wasteful practices that are happening on environmental policy in Washington State, and specifically the effort to try to purchase or try to convince the public that purchasing electric ferries makes environmental and economic sense. It's another must-read column from Todd, and I would encourage you. We might be speaking with him later. I'm not sure if he'll be able to drop in or not, but if he is, that's great. But if he doesn't, you've just got to read that blog for yourself as well. All right, first I want to turn to Lee Finne. She is our Center for Education Director. Lee, I know you've got a new op-ed coming out soon. And you've been really focused on this issue of the reduction in learning opportunities for students. Why don't you tell us what's happening right now and where we're at?
Well, it's amazing to watch. Okay, here we are 2 years after COVID. Kids, the research is coming out very strong and hard and fast, saying that we must do something to help students recover from their pandemic learning loss caused by the COVID school shutdowns. Yet the state of Washington's legislative committee on education are responding to the demands of the union to reduce the instructional hours that students get by 4 hours a week. And this happened last year. Last year they tried to do this. I forget the number of the bill, and they retreated in embarrassment when they tried to cut instructional hours by 20%. This year, they've reduced it a little bit by cutting our instructional hours by 13%. It's just an outrageous, out of touch, arrogant approach to the entire enterprise of education. And anyone with any common sense knows that more instructional hours is what's needed at this time, especially right now. Yet the union is pushing this bill, and it's 5054, and Dave, I've had quite a ride in the last week, because last week it was that's just a process statement. It was moving towards being considered by the second house, the House of Representatives has already been passed in the Senate on party line votes. Every Democrat voted to cut instructional hours by 4 hours a week. Every Republican voted against that. That was passed in the Senate. Then it went over to this House Education Committee. I testified against it. I wrote against it. And then last week I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to pass this at the end of last week. And then at the end of the week, it dropped from the executive calendar. So I thought all weekend, I'm thinking, okay, maybe we're going to win this. Then Monday morning, yesterday, I see that they have put it back on the calendar. So I thought, oh no. So I wrote an editorial against it. And then at the end of the day, yesterday, I see it's been dropped off the executive calendar. So it's clear that even the union Democrats are concerned that this is not a good idea. So, but it's certainly not won yet, but it's on, right at the moment, it is not on the executive calendar, and it has to be decided by tomorrow if they're going to follow their cutoff rules, because that's the date for, this to be moved out of committee or the bill dies. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, it seems like one of the efforts might be, because last time it was more, this time it's 13%, and then they'll just ask for another 13% 2 years from now, and they'll actually get 26%. I mean, it's a crazy approach, especially in light of COVID. But isn't it true that the superintendent of public instruction is in a bit of denial about the learning loss that's taken place?
Oh, yes. Well, he came out at the beginning of the session saying there is no such thing as pandemic learning loss. And he wagged his finger at the assembled reporters and said, don't use that term, because our children are advancing in their recovery. Or he's had some such Orwellian term to turn. I mean, as a leader of the state, the top education leader in the state, to be faithfully representing the need of children to get an education, he should have been calling at the beginning of the session for $1 billion of spending to help children recover learning loss. We're not going to get that. We may get $70 million if it passes in the budget. That's $70 per student in the state. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not impressed. That is not going to do much of anything. So it's very, I've been thinking about this sort of mindset. The union learned a very damaging lesson during the COVID school shutdown, that basically, if they decide not to reopen the schools, no one can make them, not even the governor.
Well, they could, but they're not willing. I mean, there's no political entity willing to stand up to them. Right.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that there isn't a powerful enough entity in Washington state to countermand the union's desire to keep the schools closed. So what is the lesson they would take out of COVID? Oh, let's just do less work for the same amount of money. And that's what I see as the impulse behind these bills to cut instruction time by 20% or 13%, whatever they're trying to get. Now we'll see if we've managed to, push this back. There's been a great effort by grassroots groups of parents coming forth, testifying against this bill, saying, how dare you? How could you do such a thing? And there have been thousands of people, registering. There was, I think, 1,100 people registering their opposition to this bill in the last go around in the House Education Committee, and only like 10 union people that are supporting it. So it's clearly wildly unpopular. Maybe the Democrats are saying, well, maybe we better not pass this bill this session, but it may come back next session.
It's interesting to me, let me play devil's advocate here a little bit, but it's interesting to me that, here's a case where the union wants non-certified personnel to take over teaching.
Yeah.
And historically, when there's been debates about school choice and private schools, if there's somebody who, say, majored in history teaching a history class, or majored in science teaching a science class, but they don't have that education certificate, there's been opposition among education association unions. But in this case, it's, hey, nothing to see here.
Yeah, great. Such a great point. Such a great point. Here they are, the most staunch defenders of this barrier to entry to this teaching profession. You have to get an education credential through a school of education, or else we won't let you in the classroom. Oh, that's so important. It's the only way that we can get qualified teachers before the schools, before the children. And yet here they're talking about handing over Fridays to classrooms full of non-certified school employees that don't have any training in education. I mean, it's absurd.
Now, wait, this would happen on a Friday?
Well, I'm sure it would. Okay.
Friday or a Monday morning, one of the,
yes.
one of the two. It's a happy coincidence that such things usually happen on Fridays or Monday mornings.
Yes.
Real quickly, I did want to clarify one thing you were mentioning. You were saying that you would have encouraged the state to spend $1 billion. But by that, you're not saying just throw $1 billion at the problem. You're saying throw $1 billion at private tutoring for students to be able to adapt to that loss. It's so interesting to me, because otherwise, of course, there's a lot of people that say, leave. I like the way you're thinking. Let's throw another $1 billion in our direction, but not actually use it for the students.
To clarify, great point. To clarify, okay, remember, we've got almost a $70 billion budget. So when I say Let's spend $1 billion of the revenue that the taxpayers provide to educate children. Let's give it directly to families. That would give every family about $1,000 to in an education savings account, let's say, to hire a tutor to evaluate where their child is and help them catch up in education. And why wouldn't we do that if that's the paramount duty of our state, which it is under the Constitution? But no.
Well, Danny Westneat had a column in the Seattle Times a while back, and you did a blog on it, I think, revealing that even small doses of tutoring or relatively minor expenses were having wonderful results in, I think, the North Seattle area. So it's a good reminder. Big things can happen, right?
Oh, absolutely. There was that Danny Westneat column told a story about a physics professor at UW or something who decided to focus on a low performing school in the northern part of Seattle. And he got a bunch of UW students to come volunteer twice a week and to help the kids catch up in math. And the school went from like 10% passing the state math test to 60% passing the state math test in a very short order of time. Wow. And so if there was an opportunity, so this is what we should be doing, but we're not getting this message from our leaders. And instead, they're trying to cut instruction. So what does that tell you? I have to say, I was just on listening to a webinar just now, and I have to tell you that there are now 4 states in the country, and that since January have passed universal school choice. You realize I think it was yesterday morning, Governor DeSantis passed a universal school choice ESA for the state of Florida. That makes Florida the 4th state of the union to pass universal school choice since the beginning of January. Okay, that means that there are now 6 states in response to COVID. Other states have taken a very different direction. They've said, forget this. We're going to give parents access to public funding so they can select the school their child goes to, so they can find a school that is consonant with their values, so that they can avoid a system that they don't like. And so this is taking off. And I have a list of all the states that are on deck to consider school choice in the next few months. They are Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. So that is what's happening across the country. That is what this state superintendent doesn't want anyone to talk about, but we should be talking about what's happening. There is a juggernaut towards school choice right now, and it's in response to the COVID school shutdowns and the introduction of curricula that parents really don't want taught to their children in the schools. So it's very exciting. I'm very excited about this.
Real quick, before I let you go, Lee, there's a question that's come up. There was proposed legislation to increase the number of school days per year, maybe to counter the proposed reduction. How did that bill fare? How does that approach fare? That
was a bill in the Senate introduced by Senator Brad, I've forgotten his name, out of Wenatchee. He's the ranking Republican member on the Senate Education Committee, and his bill would have added 5 days of instruction to school, and that bill was killed in committee by the Senate Education Chair, Lisa Wellman. She's the prime sponsor of this effort to cut instruction hours by 4 hours a week.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if the bill moves forward, if Republicans offer some kind of amendment saying that if the instructional value is the same, then we no longer need a teaching certificate. You can just have an area of expertise in order to qualify for teaching. I'd enjoy being in the wings just to watch the debate on that one.
Right. Good point.
Lee, I appreciate the time. Good to hear from you. And folks, you can read more from Lee at washingtonpolicy.org.
Great. Thank you.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Now let's turn to the big news of the week. It's jaw-dropping, really. It is the state Supreme Court decision on the income tax on capital gains. And one thing you'll note here, despite the decision, is unless I've directed otherwise, I'm going to always call it the income tax on capital gains because it's on income. To talk about that decision with us, Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform director, has joined us. His research on the subject is second to none, and he was identified as expert, used as some of his research as expert testimony in the decision at the Superior Court level when it was ruled unconstitutional rightly, and then suddenly the state Supreme Court got a hold of it and found all kinds of interesting ways to create a decision desired. Jason, why don't you just describe to us big picture what happened with that decision?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And I promise you I will be more composed in this update than when we last spoke, because we were on the phone live as that opinion came down, and you kind of got the unfiltered full analysis, and we'll keep this one family friendly. As you indicated, Washington State Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision decided that notwithstanding the tax analysis of the rest of the world, Washington State alone has discovered how to tax income as an excise tax, and ruled that the capital gains tax is not an income tax, despite what the IRS and every other state and every other country say. It is, in fact, an excise tax. So I'm kind of with you. I do want to give due deference and respect to our court, but I'm going to stand with the rest of the world and keep calling it an income tax, just for consistency. But where we are now, that tax is in full force and effect. It is due on April 18th. And going forward, we're going to have to see how much mischief our legislature decides to have with what the Supreme Court has provided them.
Well, one of the big problems I have is that the language is so clear, it doesn't seem subject to interpretation, that property is anything tangible or intangible subject to ownership. And we know that this particular tax, in fact, the court is aware of this, that the tax is based on the income received after a transaction, not on the transaction, thus an excise tax, but based on the income received from the transaction, which is subject to ownership and therefore subject to the 1% cap and the rest. But somehow they acknowledge that, while at the same time just arbitrarily saying, well, it's a tax on the transaction. I mean, it's a bizarre butchery of language and its meaning to me.
Yeah, when you look at the majority opinion that was written by 7 justices, it reads like a really good opinion editorial you would see in the Seattle Times. It was very heavy on rhetoric, very heavy on policy, very light on legal interpretation of the incidence of the tax. And the dissent, again, it only got 2 votes, but the dissent was beautiful. It was clear, it was factual, and it was consistent with how capital gains are treated across the world. And the dissenting justices basically said, this is obviously clearly an income tax, and underneath our Constitution, defining income to be property, a 7% tax with these exemptions is clearly unconstitutional. And the justices also pointed out in the dissent that the IRS and everybody else in the world agrees with this. And to the rhetoric that was in the majority opinion, the dissenting justices said that rhetoric may be true, but the proper venue for this debate is with a constitutional amendment. It's not the role of the judiciary to impose an income tax by fiat.
It was fascinating to me. I saw a column in the Seattle Times. I think you sent it around. There was a law professor just before this decision was handed down who was writing about how, Matt McElwain's column, for example, one of our board members, it really didn't apply to this case so much because it was a moral argument. He was making arguments in the case that were not necessarily relevant, like, about how effective our tax system is, whether or not capital would flee, how, the moral case of, is it regressive or too regressive, or is it the right, the right way? And how it affects the poor. And so, the law professor was saying none of that really applies to the court, because the court's just going to balance the language of the law. And then as you read the decision, as you point out, so much of this language is all about what's fair and what's not fair. And then they bring up this idea that the tax system is steeped in systemic racism, and they seem to do all but begging for another test case to come along, so that they can pull a McCleary on the entire tax system of Washington State. In other words, tell the legislature, you need to change this because we say you need to change this.
Yeah, whether or not the incidence of a tax is on income or a transaction, that's a very clear, that's a very simple analysis. All of that other commentary, all of that other rhetoric is irrelevant to that decision. The fact that that was in the opinion is what causes concern going forward. Because while the dissent very clearly said our prior holdings that income is property, and our prior holdings that the proper way to bring the state of Washington to graduated income taxes with the constitutional amendment, something the voters have already rejected 6 times, that was only in the dissent. The majority went out of their way. And while they didn't do it in this ruling, they didn't go to what the Washington Education Association was asking for and go ahead and strike that determination that we own our income and allow the legislature today to do a graduated income tax. That majority opinion all but begged the legislature to send them a new test case so they can do that. They clearly have the appetite for that. There's probably not time in this session for the legislature to do that, but that's what you're going to have to keep an eye on now going forward, is for that test case to come and see if we're going to have a broader income tax brought to the state of Washington bypassing a constitutional amendment.
There's a question here for you, Jason. Any state appeals possible after the capital gains income tax ruling by the Supreme Court, or is there only the possibility of federal appeal via the Commerce Clause?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court, it's Judge Dredd, right? They are the law. This is the opinion now for the state of Washington, even though it's an opinion that doesn't exist anyplace else on the planet, but that's where we are today. So for purposes of is this a property tax that violates the state constitution, that's solely a state interpretation. Where there is the potential for a federal challenge, you have 41 other states that have income taxes, and you have 41 other states, therefore, that tax capital gains income. But when you are a resident of a state, you can be taxed regardless of where that income was generated. And that's why those taxes on capital gains across the country don't have a federal violation. If you're going to say, however, that this is not an income tax, this is an excise tax. Well, excise taxes tax transactions, tax activities. A state cannot tax activities across its borders. So since we're now, as a state of Washington, saying we are reaching across our boundaries and taxing activities in other states, that is arguably a Commerce Clause violation. So you could see a federal challenge. You know, if I was a federal judge, though, I would just say, this is an income tax. There's no problem.
Another question, this from Cindy. How can they pass this when our state constitution does not allow for a state income tax? How do we get it overturned? That's the $1 million question right there.
So again, this is the determination of our state Supreme Court. This is how this tax will be interpreted for our jurisprudence and for the legislative process. So the option now is a ballot measure to repeal it, or a ballot measure to try to redefine back to the common nomenclature across the country that this is an income tax. You know, the other thing that we're going to need to keep an eye on with this ruling is this is for the first time that the Supreme Court has held that an excise tax can be measured based upon net gain, measured based upon income. So the tax you're going to really want to keep an eye on going forward is the real estate excise tax. That is currently truly an excise tax, right? You're being taxed on the sale of your home. But now that the court said that you can have an excise tax based upon net gain, that is a potential tax you're going to want to keep an eye on to see what kind of mischief the legislature might have.
Now, with property values, what they are, you know, you could net a gain of even $500,000 on a home, and all that gets you is the ability to buy another home, you know, somewhere in Western Washington. You know, it used to mean real money, and now not so much. So, oh, and we should point out that before the ink was dry on this particular capital gains tax, there was efforts this year to reduce the threshold, you know, and from $250,000 to what? What was it, Jason?
To $15,000.
To 15,000. I mean, so you know the direction this is going. Plus, you know, as you point out, if it's based on the net proceeds of the transaction, and they're still calling it the transaction tax, I don't see where that ends. I mean, if you're able to twist the very clear language of the court and the very clear language of the tax and the definitions, you know, I wouldn't rely on the court to be fair, as in play by the rules on anything. And I know that's, you know, there's people that can make hay out of that. But I mean, look, just because somebody, an authority tells me a dog's a cat or a cat's a dog, doesn't mean I'm going to buy it, right? So you know,
Dave, I've never been accused of being too optimistic about what the state of Washington is doing. But I mean, we've had these conversations over the years. I am truly shocked. I thought that this was so clear that even our court could not go sideways on it, and 7 of them did. So I think the other thing that going forward we need to realize, the court is in full policymaking mode. We right now have 3 branches of government that make policy. There's not an impartial referee at this point on the legality of state taxes. And that may mean that, just like you have with the races for the legislature and the races for the governor, these races for state Supreme Court need to get a lot more attention.
Yes. And that's really tough because, frankly, whenever you're in a judicial race, judges don't say anything. They act like they have no opinion about anything. They'll say, well, look at me, I've got all kinds of credentials, and the other person, doesn't, because they're not, as left wing as me or whatever. And it's really tough to learn anything. So, that's a big hill to climb. Here's a question from Armin. If the tax is really an excise tax, shouldn't it be on the gross amount of a stock sale transaction, as is the case with the real estate excise tax, versus on the amount of gain subject to exemptions? This may have already been stated, but it seems like another angle on the idiocy of the decision.
Yes, Armin, that's what exists everywhere else in the world. But again, that's not what our Supreme Court decided. If you listen to the rhetoric of the capital gains tax supporters and the majority opinion, what they are describing is a financial transaction tax, a tax applied at point of sale or exchange on the value or volume of a capital asset. That's an excise tax. That's entirely constitutional. Prepare to be amazed. A tax on income is an income tax. You don't sell, you don't exchange capital gains. They are the income derived from other activities, which is why everyone else will tell you it's an income tax. And this is where, again, you're going to need to pay attention to our existing excise taxes, and in particular the REIT, because this is a monumental change in tax policy in the state of Washington to say that you can have an excise tax based upon income, based upon net gain. So that door is now open, and lawmakers are creative. So that's where you're going to have to really have a lot of vigilance.
Next question from Robert on the income tax. Any discussions yet about an initiative to invalidate the implementing law? Is this appealable to the federal Supreme Court? I'll just add, we're a 501c3, so the initiative is not, it's not going to come from Washington Policy Center. But the question there is it appealable? You mentioned that already with the federal Supreme Court. And I am sure that that organizations and others will be taking a look. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, again, you will probably see a federal challenge, but it's a Hail Mary. Just to be honest with you, it's a Hail Mary. The most likely response will be a ballot measure, and you'll just have to see how that takes shape.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see that Hail Mary, and then the justices say, yeah, we'll just take this one. It's a one-word ruling. Wrong. That's about it, because I've been calling it it's like linguistic camouflage for what the tax really is, or political camouflage for a policy that was desired, and it's pretty clear to people who I think want to look at it objectively. Anyway, Jason, as always, you did great work. I know this has got to be frustrating for you, having devoted so much of your working life to this particular issue with such passion over the years. But look, it's not over yet. It's the push goes on, and I guess most of this lands with in the hands of the voters of the state of Washington and the people, if they want to hold elected officials accountable, including justices.
Yeah, and ironically, this ruling probably means that we won't see too many tax games played in the existing budgets, right? Both the House and the Senate budgets have come out, and the Senate budget came out before the ruling. So they actually left capacity in their reserves had this been overturned. Basically, what that means is currently neither of these budgets have tax increases in them. And, I guess, and a silver lining of the court having upheld this tax is now there's not any discussions about using a struck down income tax as an excuse to raise other taxes, at least yet.
Yeah, I'm sure they're willing to, nothing's ever quite dead in the legislature, and so don't give them any ideas on that score. One quick thing, though, we've already seen some movement. It turns out that, as you pointed out, when Governor Jerry Brown was governor of California again, he pointed out that the capital gains tax was a volatile source of income for the state and led to a lot of budget problems, because people move and capital goes. There's a roller coaster effect to the gains issue. Your thoughts on the announcement from Fisher Investments that they're changing headquarters, keeping in mind that the newspaper is very careful to say that the investor had already said, well, it doesn't mean that much about a headquarters changing because it's just something on paper. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was interesting to see the governor's Casablanca moment. They were shocked that a business would relocate for tax purposes. Unfortunately, this is going to be the first of many, because over the last few years, it's not only those that may leave, but those that never came. I was fielding phone calls from California businessmen and women looking to flee the state and telling me, I'd love to come to Washington. Washington is a much prettier state than Nevada or Texas. But what's going to happen here with this case? I'm not sure you're a safe bet anymore. So I guess I'm not going to have to go to Nevada or Texas. So it's not only those that are leaving, but those that never come. And the response from the governor's office and from other people hearing about this has been like, oh, we don't need them. They should go. We don't want those type of people here. Well, you have the multiplier effect of all of the employees, the B&O tax, the sales tax, the property tax. I don't understand this viewpoint that we only want the right businesses in the state of Washington and not those that are concerned about their profitability.
Also, the way they frame it was, I'm shocked that they wouldn't want to pay a tax for children, and you think, okay, how many billions of dollars in surplus revenue have we had? And what has been the reduction of the state sales tax, the thing that hits middle and lower income people the most with their families? And how many cuts to the state sales tax have we received since 1982, 40 years ago? The answer is zero, right?
Yeah, we've had the amount of tax relief as there has been voter support for an income tax. None. And the interesting thing about this is the response after this ruling came down from the lawmakers that were advocating for this tax wasn't, oh, great, now we have the capacity for a sales tax cut or a property tax cut. No, the response was, all right, let's do the wealth tax. Let's double down.
Yeah. There's even prior to session, remember, majority leadership was asked specifically about reducing the state sales tax, and the attitude expressed was, well, we want to be able to target and plan and control what kind of benefits people get and who gets them, as though somehow they know, what struggles people are going through at all levels. I mean, I know when I'm paying groceries now, I feel it very strongly. And so it's a frustrating thing to see. Jason, really appreciate your work. As always, we appreciate you supporting us at Washington Policy Center. We'll continue our efforts against this ridiculous and unfair taxation. Our aim is to keep Washington income tax free, and that has not changed. So you can stay tuned with Washington Policy Center for more news and information. We'll be tracking any new taxes that come up. Jason's the best I've ever known at that, and always appreciate that information. And we'll keep you updated as well. Jason, again, thank you, and thanks to everybody else. We'll see you all next week on next Tuesday for another edition of Washington Policy on the Go. Thanks, Jason.